In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and unbreakable determination, sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about the people sitting right next to us. What happens when a battle-hardened Navy SEAL discovers that the quiet officer he's been dismissing might just be the most lethal person in the room? This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, whose simple response to workplace mockery revealed a secret so shocking that it left an entire military cafeteria speechless and forced everyone to question everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve your country. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Naval Special Warfare Command cafeteria, casting their familiar harsh glow across rows of metal tables where some of America's most elite warriors grabbed quick meals between training sessions. It was just afternoon on a Tuesday in San Diego, and the usual crowd had gathered. Navy SEALs, fresh from morning PT, sat in their typical clusters, their conversation a mixture of operational planning and the kind of dark humor that came naturally to men who faced death as a regular part of their job description. Lieutenant Sarah Chun sat alone at a corner table, methodically working through a salad while reviewing personnel files on her tablet. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build, she seemed almost invisible among the physically imposing special operations personnel that filled the space around her. Her uniform was crisp and properly pressed, her black hair pulled back in regulation style, and her demeanor was that of someone who preferred observation to participation in the boisterous conversations echoing throughout the room. Sarah had been assigned to the command just 3 weeks earlier as part of the administrative support staff, handling logistics coordination and personnel management for various SEAL teams rotating through advanced training programs. Her background was in supply chain management and organizational psychology, skills that were invaluable to keeping complex military operations running smoothly, but hardly the stuff of warrior legend. To most of the SEALs who passed her desk daily, she was simply another desk jockey, one of the many support personnel who made their missions possible, but who would never understand the real weight of what they carried. It wasn't malicious dismissal, exactly, but rather the natural tendency of operators to distinguish between those who had been tested in combat and those who had not. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez noticed her sitting alone and nudged his teammate, Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison. "Look at the LT over there," Marcus said, gesturing toward Sarah with a sandwich. 3 weeks, and she still eats by herself. "Think she's scared of us." Jake glanced over and shrugged. "Probably just knows her place. Smart to stay in her lane." He took a bite of his burger and continued, "Nothing wrong with that. We need good admin people, just as long as they don't start thinking they're operators." The comment wasn't intended to be heard beyond their table, but the cafeteria acoustics carried it clearly to where Sarah sat. She looked up briefly, made eye contact with Jake, and then returned to her files without expression. The exchange might have ended there, forgotten in the daily rhythm of military life, except that Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Valdez had different ideas about entertainment. Tommy was known throughout the teams for his mouth as much as his marksmanship skills. He had opinions about everything and rarely hesitated to share them, especially when he thought he could get a laugh from his teammates. He was also nursing a bruised ego from a particularly difficult training exercise that morning where his performance had been less than stellar, and he was looking for an opportunity to reassert himself in the social hierarchy. "Hey, LT," Tommy called out, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "Question for you." Sarah looked up from her tablet, her expression neutral but alert. "Yes, Petty Officer?" "I was just wondering," Tommy continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality that drew attention from nearby tables. "What exactly is it that you do around here? I mean, besides pushing papers and making sure our coffee supplies are properly inventoried." A few chuckles rippled through the nearby tables. Sarah set down her fork deliberately and turned to face Tommy directly. "I handle logistics coordination and personnel management for your training rotations, Petty Officer. I ensure that the resources you need for your operations are available when and where you need them." Right. Tommy nodded mockingly. "Super important stuff. Really vital to national security." He looked around at his audience, encouraged by a few more grins. "But here's what I'm really curious about. You've got those shiny lieutenant bars, which means somebody thinks you're qualified to give orders to enlisted men like us. Men who've been downrange, who've seen real action. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. I'm qualified for my position, petty officer. Oh, I'm sure you are, Tommy pressed on. Top of your class at supply school, probably. Really knew your way around those spreadsheets. But tell me, LT, what exactly makes you think you understand what we do? What gives you the authority to make decisions about resources for operations you've never been on, in places you've never been to, against enemies you've never faced? The cafeteria had grown quieter now, with conversations at other tables either stopping entirely or dropping to whispers. This kind of direct challenge to an officer, even a support officer, was walking a fine line, and everyone knew it. But Tommy was a decorated SEAL with 3 combat deployments, and his frustration was shared by many of his peers who sometimes felt that their operations were hindered by administrative personnel who didn't understand the realities of their work. Sarah stood slowly, her movement fluid and controlled. She walked over to Tommy's table with measured steps, her hands clasped loosely behind her back in a posture that suggested military bearing rather than defensiveness. When she reached the table, she looked down at Tommy with an expression that was impossible to read. That's an interesting question, Petty Officer Valdez, she said quietly. You want to know what gives me the authority to make decisions about your operations? Damn right I do, Tommy replied, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. Because from where I sit, you're just another officer who's never had to make a life or death decision. Try to tell real warriors how to do their job. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You think I've never been in a life or death situation? Have you? Tommy challenged. Have you ever been shot at? Have you ever had to kill someone to protect your teammates? Have you ever had to make a split-second decision that meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box? The cafeteria was now completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering to listen. Sarah looked around the room briefly, taking in the faces that were all turned toward her, some curious, some skeptical, some simply waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Those are fair questions, she said finally, and you deserve honest answers. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. The truth is, petty officer, I have been in life or death situations. I have been shot at. I have had to kill people to protect others. And I have made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. Tommy snorted. Right. When was this? During some weekend warrior exercise? A paintball competition, maybe. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, something that the more experienced SEALs in the room recognized instinctively. It was the subtle transformation that happened when someone moved from a state of calm alertness to a state of predatory focus. It was in Afghanistan, she said quietly. Helmand Province. 3 years ago, I was attached to a Special Activities Division unit as an intelligence liaison. We were conducting a raid on a Taliban command post when our extraction was compromised. I spent 6 hours in a firefight where I was responsible for coordinating air support while simultaneously providing sniper cover for my team's withdrawal. The room had gone from quiet to absolutely dead silent. Special Activities Division was the CIA's paramilitary arm, an organization so secretive that most SEALs only knew of its existence through rumors and secondhand stories. The idea that the quiet administrative officer they'd been dismissing might have been part of such an operation was almost impossible to process. Tommy's confident smirk was beginning to falter. You're saying you were CIA? I'm saying I was assigned to a joint task force that included CIA personnel, Sarah replied carefully. My role was to provide technical intelligence support and coordination. But when a situation deteriorated, everyone fights. That's how it works when you're outnumbered and surrounded. Bullshit, Tommy said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. If that were true, it would be in your personnel file. We know about it. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Would you? How many classified operations do you think appear in unclassified personnel files, petty officer? How many SAT operations do you think get documented in ways that are accessible to standard military databases? Marcus Rodriguez, who had been listening with growing unease, finally spoke up. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was your MOS before you transferred to admin? Sarah turned to look at Marcus, and for the first time since the conversation began, she smiled slightly. It wasn't a particularly warm smile. Military intelligence. specialized in target acquisition and battlefield damage assessment. Before that, I spent 2 years at the farm. The farm was the CIA's training facility at Camp Peary, a place where the agency's most secretive operatives learned their trade. The fact that Sarah had mentioned it so casually, without explanation or elaboration, sent a chill through the room. Only someone who had actually been there would reference it so matter-of-factly. Jake Morrison, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, leaned forward. "Ma'am, why are you an admin now if you have that kind of background?" Sarah's smile faded. "Because sometimes, Mr. Morrison, people get tired of killing for a living. Sometimes they want to try something different. Something that involves keeping people alive instead of putting them in the ground." She turned back to Tommy, whose face had gone pale. "But, to answer your original question, Petty Officer Valdez, what gives me the authority to make decisions about your operations is not my rank, and it's not my administrative position. It's the fact that I understand exactly what you face out there because I've faced it myself. The difference is that I've learned that there are other ways to serve than by pulling a trigger." Tommy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the table at his teammates, seeking support, but found only shocked silence and avoiding eyes. The revelation that he had been challenging not just an officer, but an officer with a combat record that likely exceeded his own, had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the confrontation. Sarah looked around the cafeteria one more time, her gaze taking in the dozens of faces staring back at her. "I know that most of you see me as just another desk jockey, someone who doesn't understand the real work that you do. And I've been content to let you think that because it makes my job easier when people underestimate me." She paused, letting that sink in. "But since we're having this conversation, let me be clear about something. I may work in administration now, but I haven't forgotten how to fight. I haven't forgotten what it means to be downrange. And I certainly haven't forgotten what it feels like to have someone's life depending on the decisions I make." The silence in the cafeteria was so complete that the humming of the fluorescent lights seemed almost deafening. Sarah looked down at Tommy one last time. "I hope that answers your question, Petty Officer. If you have any others, I'll be at my desk." She turned and walked back to her table, collected her tablet and lunch tray, and headed for the exit. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back. "And Tommy, the next time you want to challenge someone's qualifications, you might want to make sure you know who you're talking to first." The door swung shut behind her, leaving the cafeteria in stunned silence. The aftermath of Sarah's revelation rippled through the Naval Special Warfare Command like a depth charge detonating in still water. Within minutes of her departure from the cafeteria, the story was being whispered through corridors, briefing rooms, and training facilities. But what started as gossip quickly evolved into something more serious, as people began to ask questions about the quiet lieutenant who had just turned their assumptions upside down. Tommy Valdez sat at his table for several minutes after Sarah left, staring at the spot where she had stood. His teammates exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Finally, Marcus Rodriguez broke the silence. "Well, that was fucking unexpected," he said quietly. Jake Morrison shook his head slowly. "Did she really just say she was sad? Like actual Special Activities Division?" "That's what it sounded like," replied Chief Petty Officer Williams from a nearby table. Williams was a 15-year veteran with 4 combat deployments, and his voice carried a weight of experience that younger SEALs respected. "And if she was telling the truth about being at the farm, that's not something you just make up. That place doesn't exist on any official maps for a reason." Tommy finally found his voice. "She could be lying, making it all up to shut me down." Williams stood up and walked over to Tommy's table, his expression serious. "Son, let me explain something to you. In my experience, people who have actually been in the shit don't talk about it unless they have to. They don't brag about it. They don't use it to win arguments. And they sure as hell don't make it up for attention." He leaned down, bringing his face close to Tommy's. "What just happened here was someone who has been perfectly content to let you think she was nobody special until you pushed her too far. That's not the behavior of someone who's lying. That's the behavior of someone who knows exactly how dangerous they are and chooses not to advertise it." The weight of Williams' words settled over the table like a lead blanket. Tommy had been in the teams long enough to understand the truth in what the chief was saying. Real operators didn't need to prove themselves with words. They proved themselves through actions, and They were often the quietest people in the room until the situation demanded otherwise. "Shit," Tommy muttered, running his hands through his hair. "I really screwed this up, didn't I?" "Yeah, you did," Williams replied bluntly. "The question now is what you're going to do about it." Meanwhile, news of the cafeteria incident had already reached the command staff offices. Commander Jessica Hayes, the executive officer of the training command, was reviewing operational reports when her phone rang. On the other end was Master Chief Petty Officer David Shun, the senior enlisted advisor who had witnessed the entire confrontation from across the cafeteria. "Ma'am, we might have a situation," Master Chief Shun said without preamble. "One of our SEALs just got into a verbal altercation with Lieutenant Shun, and some things came to light that I think you need to know about." Commander Hayes set down her paperwork. "What kind of things, Master Chief?" "The kind that suggests Lieutenant Shun might not be quite what her personnel file indicates. She just told a room full of SEALs that she has SAT experience and training from Camp Peary." There was a long pause on Hayes' end of the line. "Are you certain about what you heard?" "Yes, ma'am." And the way she said it, the way she carried herself when she was challenged. "Ma'am, I've been around long enough to recognize the real thing when I see it." That wasn't someone bluffing. Commander Hayes felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had been in naval intelligence herself before moving to Special Operations Command, and she knew that personnel with certain types of classified backgrounds were sometimes assigned to administrative positions as a form of cover or transition. But she also knew that such assignments usually came with discreet notifications to the commanding officers. "I'll look into this, Master Chief. In the meantime, I want you to keep this quiet until I can figure out what's really going on." "Understood, Mom. But there's something else you should know." The SEAL who challenged her was Petty Officer Valdez, and from what I could see, he's pretty shaken up by what happened. Might want to have someone talk to him before this turns into a bigger problem. After hanging up, Commander Hayes immediately accessed the classified personnel database and began searching for Lieutenant Sarah Chen's full record. What she found there made her blood run cold. Sarah's file was extensively redacted, with entire sections marked as requiring higher security clearances than Hayes possessed. But what was visible painted a picture of someone whose qualifications far exceeded anything that would be necessary for an administrative position. Advanced certifications in psychological operations, linguistics, tactical communications, and survival training. Completion of the combat applications course at Camp Peary. Assignment history that included 2 years of unspecified duties with a joint task force operating in Afghanistan. And, most telling of all, a security clearance level that was typically reserved for people involved in the most sensitive operations the United States military conducted. Hayes picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she rarely had cause to use. The voice that answered was crisp and professional. Deputy Director Morrison's office. "This is Commander Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Command, San Diego. I need to speak with the Deputy Director regarding a personnel matter that may involve one of his people." "Please hold, Commander." Several minutes passed before a new voice came on the line. "Commander Hayes, this is Deputy Director Morrison. I understand you have questions about someone on your staff." "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Sarah Chun. She's been assigned to my command for administrative duties, but some information came to light today that suggests her background might be more complex than her unclassified file indicates." There was a pause. "What kind of information?" Hayes described the cafeteria incident, being careful to include all the details she had received from Master Chief Chin. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Commander, I'm going to need you to treat this conversation as classified," Deputy Director Morrison said finally. "Lieutenant Shun is indeed one of ours. She was assigned to your command as part of a transition program for operatives who are stepping back from active field duty." "Sir, with respect, shouldn't I have been informed about this when she was assigned to my command?" "Under normal circumstances, yes. But Lieutenant Shun specifically requested that her background not be disclosed unless it became operationally necessary. She wanted to try functioning in a normal military environment without the complications that come with her reputation." Hayes felt pieces clicking into place. "What kind of reputation are we talking about, sir?" "The kind that makes hardened special operations personnel nervous when they know who she really is," Morrison replied. "Lieutenant Chun has a confirmed kill count that exceeds most of your SEALs, and She's operated in theaters where the margin for error was essentially zero. She's also dealing with some psychological trauma from her time in the field, which is why she requested the administrative assignment. She was trying to decompress. And now that cover is blown. Yes, it is. Which means we're going to need to have some conversations about how to proceed. Morrison paused. Commander, I need you to understand something about Lieutenant Chun. She's not just another intelligence officer. She was part of a very select group of operatives who handled situations that were too sensitive even for SEAL teams. The fact that she's been willing to work in admin and keep her mouth shut about her background is actually remarkable. Most people with her skill set can't adjust to civilian-style military duty. Hayes absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the quiet officer she had observed for the past 3 weeks with the picture Morrison was painting. Sir, is she dangerous? I mean, to my personnel? Only if they threaten her or put her in a corner, Morrison replied. But, Commander, the fact that she's been managing logistics for your SEAL teams without any incidents should tell you something about her self-control. Someone with her training could have dominated your entire command structure from day one if that's what she wanted to do. Instead, she chose to file paperwork and coordinate supply shipments. Exactly, which tells me she's genuinely trying to transition away from the operational side of things. The question now is whether she'll be able to continue that transition or whether today's incident has compromised it. After ending the call with Morrison, Hayes sat in her office for a long time, staring out the window at the training facilities where SEALs were conducting their daily exercises. She had commanded special operations personnel for 5 years, and she thought she had seen everything. But the idea that one of the most lethal operatives in American intelligence had been quietly managing their filing systems for 3 weeks without anyone knowing was almost surreal. Her contemplation was interrupted by a knock on her door. Come in. Lieutenant Sarah Chun entered, her expression composed but alert. Ma'am, Master Chief Chun suggested I should report to you regarding an incident in the cafeteria today. Hayes gestured to the chair across from her desk. Please sit down, Lieutenant. I think we need to have a conversation. Sarah sat, maintaining perfect military posture. Yes, ma'am. I just got off the phone with Deputy Director Morrison, Hayes said, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. He filled me in on your actual background and the circumstances of your assignment to this command. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Hayes noticed a subtle tightening around her eyes. I see. He also told me that you specifically requested that your background remain classified unless it became necessary to disclose it. That's correct, ma'am. Hayes leaned forward. Help me understand something, Lieutenant. You had the opportunity to defuse that situation in the cafeteria without revealing anything classified. You could have simply told Petty Officer Valdez that your background was need to know and left it at that. Instead, you chose to expose yourself. Why? Sarah was quiet for several moments, seeming to consider her words carefully. Commander, in my experience, there are 2 ways to handle disrespect. You can ignore it, which sometimes works in the short term, but often leads to escalation. Or you can address it definitively in a way that prevents it from happening again. And you chose the definitive approach. I chose the approach that would be most effective in this specific environment, Sarah replied. SEALs respect competence and experience above all else. Trying to pull rank or hide behind regulations would have made the problem worse. They needed to understand that I'm not just some desk jockey who doesn't understand their world. Hayes nodded slowly. Morrison mentioned that you're dealing with some trauma from your field work. How are you handling the stress of having your cover blown? For the first time since entering the office, Sarah's composure seemed to waver slightly. It's complicated, ma'am. Part of me is relieved that I don't have to pretend anymore. But another part of me knows that this changes everything about how I can function here. How so? Before today, I was invisible. I could do my job, help these teams be more effective, and nobody asked questions about my qualifications or my methods. Now, everyone is going to be watching me, evaluating me, trying to figure out who I really am and what I'm capable of. Sarah paused. That kind of attention is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Hayes studied Sarah's face, noting the fatigue that seemed to go deeper than simple tiredness. Lieutenant, can I ask you something personal? Of course, ma'am. Why did you really request an administrative assignment? Morrison said it was because of trauma, but I get the feeling there's more to it than that. Sarah looked down at her hands, and For the first time since Hayes had known her, she looked vulnerable. Because I was tired of being good at killing people, ma'am. I was tired of being the one they sent when someone needed to die, quietly and efficiently. I was tired of being defined by my ability to end lives instead of my ability to preserve them. The honesty in her voice was striking, and Hayes felt a wave of sympathy for the young woman sitting across from her. And you thought working in administration would give you a different identity. I hoped it would let me contribute to the mission in a way that didn't require me to hurt anyone, Sarah replied. I wanted to see if I could be useful for something other than violence. Hayes leaned back in her chair. And how is that working out for you? Before today, I mean. A small smile crossed Sarah's face. Better than I expected, actually. I liked coordinating resources for your teams. I liked making sure they had what they needed to be successful. It felt good to be part of something where my role was to support and enable rather than to eliminate. And now, the smile faded. Now I'm not sure if that's still possible. Once people know what you're capable of, it's hard to convince them that you're choosing not to use those capabilities. Hayes considered this carefully. Sarah was right that her revelation in the cafeteria had fundamentally altered her position within the command. The question was whether that change had to be negative or whether it could be managed in a way that allowed her to continue her transition while still maintaining her effectiveness. Lieutenant, what would you say if I told you that I think this might actually work out in your favor? Sarah looked up, surprised. I'm not sure I follow, ma'am. What you demonstrated today wasn't just that you have a classified background. You demonstrated something much more important. You showed that you have the judgment to know when to reveal information and when to keep it hidden. You showed that you can be pushed to a certain point without losing control, but that you won't be bullied or disrespected. Hayes paused, and you showed that you're choosing to be here, doing this job, not because you have to, but because you want to. I'm not sure everyone will see it that way. Maybe not everyone, but the people whose opinions matter will. And frankly, Lieutenant, having someone with your background and experience working in logistics coordination is probably the best thing that's happened to this command in years. The fact that you understand the operational realities that our teams face means you can anticipate their needs in ways that someone with a purely administrative background never could. Sarah looked skeptical, assuming they can get past the fact that I've been hiding who I really am for the past 3 weeks. I think you might be surprised, Hayes said. In my experience, special operations personnel respect competence and honesty above everything else. You've demonstrated both of those things today. The fact that you were competent enough to keep your background hidden when necessary and honest enough to reveal it when challenged will actually increase their respect for you, not decrease it. And if it doesn't, Hayes smiled. Then they'll learn to respect you the hard way. Because whether they like it or not, Lieutenant, you're exactly the kind of person who should be supporting their operations. Someone who understands what they face, who has been where they're going, and who can anticipate what they'll need to succeed. Sarah nodded slowly, seeming to consider this perspective. What happens next, ma'am? Next, you go back to your desk and continue doing the excellent job you've been doing for the past 3 weeks. And when people ask you questions about your background, you answer them honestly within the bounds of what you're allowed to discuss. No more hiding, but no more revelations than necessary either. And Petty Officer Valdez? Hayes' expression became more serious. Petty Officer Valdez is going to learn a very important lesson about making assumptions. But that's between him and his chain of command. Your job is to continue doing your job. As Sarah stood to leave, Hayes called after her. Lieutenant, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice today. Sometimes the best way to de-escalate a situation is to make it very clear that escalation would be a mistake. Sarah paused at the door. Thank you, ma'am. I hope you're right. After she left, Hayes sat back in her chair and considered the complexity of the situation she was now managing. She had a CIA operative working in her logistics department, a SEAL who had just learned that his assumptions could be dangerously wrong, and a command full of special operations personnel who were about to discover that their quiet administrative officer was more dangerous than most of them would ever be. But as she thought about it, Hayes realized that she was actually looking forward to seeing how this played out. Because if Sarah Chan could successfully navigate this transition from covert operative to administrative officer, it might prove that even the most hardened warriors could find new ways to serve their country when their time in the field was over. And That was a lesson that everyone in special operations needed to learn eventually. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to the Naval Special Warfare Command. Where the previous day's cafeteria incident had spread throughout the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve, but the usual morning bustle seemed subdued. Personnel moved through their routines with a heightened awareness, as if everyone was waiting to see how the revelation about Lieutenant Sarah Chun would affect the carefully maintained social dynamics of the command. Sarah arrived at her office at 0630, the same time she had every morning since her assignment began. Her desk was located in a corner of the administrative wing, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer terminals that served as the nerve center for logistical coordination. She had always appreciated the relative isolation of the space, but now she wondered if that privacy would become a liability as people's curiosity about her background intensified. She had barely settled at her desk when Master Chief Petty Officer David Chun appeared in her doorway. Despite sharing a surname, they were not related, though the coincidence had been a source of occasional confusion among the clerical staff. "Morning, Lieutenant," Master Chief Chun said. "Got a minute?" Sarah looked up from her computer screen. "Of course, Master Chief. Please come in." He entered and closed the door behind him, then took the chair across from her desk. His expression was serious, but not unfriendly. "I want to talk to you about yesterday. I figured you might. Look, ma'am, I've been in the Navy for 22 years. I've seen a lot of things, worked with a lot of different people. What you did in that cafeteria yesterday, that took guts." Sarah tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? You could have let Valdez keep running his mouth and then handled it through official channels. Written him up for disrespecting an officer. Let his chain of command deal with it. That would have been the safe play. Master Chief Chun leaned forward. Instead, you chose to handle it directly, face to face, in a way that shut down the disrespect without destroying the kid's career. That tells me something about your character. It tells you what exactly? That you understand the difference between winning an argument and solving a problem, he replied. Valdez was disrespectful, but he wasn't malicious. He's a good SEAL who was having a bad day and made some assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The way you handled it gave him a chance to learn from his mistake without humiliating him beyond recovery. Sarah nodded slowly. I've been where he is, Master Chief. Early in my career, I made some assumptions about people that turned out to be very wrong. Someone could have ended my career over it, but instead, they chose to educate me. I try to pay that forward when I can. That's what I'm talking about, Master Chief Chun said. Leadership isn't about proving you're the biggest dog in the pack. It's about making everyone in the pack stronger. He paused. The scuttlebutt says you've got some serious operational experience. Some, Sarah replied carefully. More than some, from what I'm hearing. But here's what I want you to know. The fact that you've chosen to keep that quiet, to come in here and do the job that needed doing without making a big deal about your background, that's earned you respect from people who matter. Sarah felt a slight easing of the tension she had been carrying since the previous day. I appreciate that, Master Chief. Now, that said, he continued, things are going to be different going forward. People are going to be watching you, testing you, trying to figure out where you fit in the hierarchy now that they know you're not just another admin officer. You ready for that? I'm not sure anyone can be ready for that kind of scrutiny, Sarah admitted. But I'll deal with it as it comes. Master Chief Chun stood to leave, then paused. One more thing, ma'am. Valdez is going to want to apologize to you. When he does, I'd recommend accepting it gracefully. That kid's got potential, and yesterday's mistake doesn't define who he is. After he left, Sarah tried to focus on her morning routine of reviewing overnight message traffic and updating operational status boards, but she found herself distracted by the constant flow of personnel passing by her office. Some glanced in curiously, others made excuses to stop by with questions that could have been handled via email, and a few simply stared as they walked past. By mid-morning, the disruption to her normal workflow was becoming significant. The situation reached a turning point when Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos knocked on her doorframe. Santos was the senior enlisted advisor for SEAL Team 5, a woman with a reputation for straight talk and zero tolerance for nonsense. Lieutenant, got a few minutes? Of course, Senior Chief. Please sit down. Santos entered but remained standing. I'll keep this brief. I've got about 30 guys who are supposed to be focused on preparing for deployment, but instead, they're gossiping like teenagers about what happened yesterday. It's becoming a distraction. Sarah leaned back in her chair. I see. And you think I should do something about that? I think you should consider addressing it directly. These guys respect straight talk. The more you let them speculate and wonder, the bigger this thing is going to grow in their minds. What are you suggesting? Team briefing. This afternoon, you come in, lay out the facts within whatever security constraints you have to work with, and let them ask their questions. Get it out in the open so we can all move on. Sarah considered this. The idea of voluntarily putting herself in front of a room full of SEALs and subjecting herself to questioning was not appealing, but she could see the logic in Santos' suggestion. You think that would help? I think it would show that you're confident enough in who you are to face their curiosity head-on. And I think it would demonstrate that you understand how teams work in this environment. Santos paused. Plus, it would give you a chance to set some boundaries about what is and isn't appropriate to ask about. And if they ask questions I can't answer, then you tell them you can't answer, and you explain why. These guys understand operational security. What they don't understand is mystery and uncertainty. After Santos left, Sarah spent the rest of the morning thinking about the proposal. Part of her wanted to continue, trying to minimize the disruption by keeping her head down and hoping the curiosity would fade. But she had enough experience with military culture to know that Santos was probably right. Speculation would continue to grow until it was addressed directly. She was still weighing her options when Tommy Valdez appeared in her doorway. He looked uncomfortable and nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he waited for her to acknowledge him. "Petty Officer Valdez," she said. "What can I do for you?" "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. What I said, how I said it was out of line. I should have shown you proper respect regardless of what I thought about your background." Sarah studied his face for a moment. The cockiness that had been so apparent the day before was completely gone, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Apology accepted, Petty Officer. We all make mistakes." "Thank you, ma'am. But I need you to understand that I don't just feel bad because I was wrong about who you are. I feel bad because I was disrespectful to an officer, period. That's not who I am, and it's not how I was trained to behave." "I appreciate that," Sarah replied. "And I want you to know that I don't hold grudges. What happened yesterday is over as far as I'm concerned." Tommy seemed to relax slightly. "Master Chief Chun said you might be willing to do a team briefing this afternoon. To clear the air, you know." Senior Chief Santos suggested the same thing. "What's your opinion?" "Honestly, ma'am, I think it would help. The guys are curious, and when SEALs get curious about something they can't figure out, it can become a problem. But if you're straight with them, if you treat them like professionals who can handle classified information appropriately, they'll respect that." Sarah made her decision. "All right, set it up for 1,500 hours in the main briefing room. Who should attend?" "All of Team 5, plus any other personnel who were in the cafeteria yesterday. Maybe 30 people total." "And Tommy? Make sure everyone understands that this is not an entertainment event. I'm willing to answer appropriate questions, but I'm not there to satisfy idle curiosity or provide war stories." "Understood, Mom. And thank you. This means a lot." The rest of the morning passed quickly as word of the briefing spread through the command. Sarah used the time to prepare her remarks and to consider what information she could share within the constraints of her security clearance. She also called Deputy Director Morrison to inform him of her plans and to ensure that she wouldn't inadvertently compromise ongoing operations. "I think that's a smart move," Morrison said when she explained the situation. "Just remember to focus on the general principles rather than specific operations. You could discuss your training and your general areas of responsibility without getting into details that could compromise sources and methods. Any specific guidance on what I should avoid? Don't mention any real names, locations, or dates. Don't discuss specific operational techniques or targets. And don't talk about ongoing activities or personnel who are still active in the field." Morrison paused. "But you can discuss the fact that you've been in combat, that you've worked with Special Operations Forces, and that you've received specialized training. The key is to be honest without being specific." "Understood. Sarah, good luck. I know this isn't what you wanted when you requested the assignment, but maybe it's what you need. At 1,500 hours, Sarah made her way to the main briefing room. The space was typically used for operational planning sessions and could accommodate about 50 people in theater-style seating. When she entered, she found approximately 30 SEALs, support personnel, and command staff waiting for her. The atmosphere was expectant but respectful. Senior Chief Santos stood as she entered. "Attention on deck." "As you were," Sarah said quickly, gesturing for everyone to remain seated. She made her way to the front of the room and stood behind the podium, looking out at the assembled group. "Good afternoon. I'm here because Senior Chief Santos and several others suggested that it would be helpful to address some of the questions that arose from yesterday's incident in the cafeteria. Before I begin, I want to establish some ground rules." She paused, making eye contact with various individuals throughout the room. "First, everything we discuss here is classified at a minimum of secret level. Nothing leaves this room. Second, I will answer appropriate questions honestly, but there are some things I cannot and will not discuss due to operational security requirements. Third, this is not story time. I'm not here to entertain you with tales of daring do. I'm here to provide context that will help us all work together more effectively." A hand went up in the front row. Sarah nodded at the sailor, a petty officer first class she recognized from the logistics coordination meetings. "Ma'am, can you tell us about your actual background? Like, what you did before you came here?" "I can give you the general outline," Sarah replied. "I was commissioned as an intelligence officer 8 years ago. After initial training, I was selected for additional specialized training at various facilities, including Camp Peary. I then served for approximately 4 years in various capacities with joint task forces operating primarily in Afghanistan and other areas of Southwest Asia. My roles included intelligence collection, analysis, and liaison duties with Special Operations Forces." Another hand. "Ma'am, when you say liaison duties, what does that mean exactly?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "It means I was responsible for ensuring effective communication and coordination between intelligence assets and operational units. Sometimes that involved staying in rear areas and managing information flow. Sometimes it involved deploying forward with operational teams to provide real-time intelligence support. And the combat experience you mentioned yesterday, there were occasions when intelligence personnel attached to operational units found themselves in combat situations. When that happened, we were expected to contribute to the mission and the team's survival to the best of our abilities." Master Chief Chun spoke from the back of the room. "Ma'am, what made you decide to move into administrative work?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading, but she had prepared for it. "After several years of operational deployments, I reached a point where I wanted to continue serving, but in a different capacity. Administrative and logistics work still supports the mission, but it allows me to contribute in ways that don't require the same level of personal risk or the same types of decision-making that field work involves." A voice from the middle of the room asked, "Are you planning to stay in admin, or is this temporary?" "That depends on a lot of factors that I can't predict right now," Sarah replied honestly. "What I can tell you is that I'm committed to doing the best job I can in my current position for as long as I'm assigned here." Tommy Valdez raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, I know I was out of line yesterday, but I guess I'm still confused about something. If you have the kind of background you're describing, why didn't anyone tell us when you got here? It seems like that would be relevant information for people working with you." Sarah nodded. "That's a fair question. The truth is, I specifically requested that my operational background not be disclosed when I took this assignment. I wanted to see if I could function effectively in a traditional military administrative role without the complications that sometimes come with my previous experience." "What kind of complications?" someone called out. "The kind where people focus more on what I used to do than on what I'm doing now. Where they make assumptions about my motivations or my capabilities that interfere with normal working relationships." Sarah looked around the room. "I wanted to be judged on my performance as a logistics coordinator, not on my reputation as an intelligence operative." Senior Chief Santos spoke up. "Ma'am, how do you want us to handle this going forward? I mean, now that we know?" "The same way you handled it before you knew," Sarah replied. "I'm still the same person doing the same job. The only difference is that now you have a better understanding of why I might approach certain problems differently than someone with a purely administrative background." A hand went up near the back. "Ma'am, does your background mean you'll be making decisions about our operations differently now?" "No, My job is still to provide logistical support and coordination for your training and operations. My background may help me anticipate your needs more effectively, but it doesn't change my role or my authority. Sarah paused. However, if anyone has concerns about my ability to support your mission effectively, I encourage you to discuss those concerns with me directly rather than letting them fester. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics from her training background to her security clearance level to her long-term career plans. Sarah answered what she could and politely declined to discuss what she couldn't, always explaining why certain topics were off-limits. Finally, she sensed that the curiosity had been largely satisfied. Any final questions? Tommy Valdez raised his hand one last time. Ma'am, I just want to say thank you for being willing to do this. And I'm sorry again for yesterday. I learned something important about making assumptions, and I won't forget it. Sarah smiled for the first time during the briefing. We all make mistakes, petty officer. The measure of a person is how they handle the aftermath. You've handled it well. As the briefing ended and personnel began filing out of the room, Sarah felt a sense of relief that surprised her. For weeks, she had been carrying the weight of maintaining a false identity, of constantly monitoring her words and actions to ensure that she didn't slip and reveal something that would compromise her cover. Now, with the truth out in the open, she realized that the burden of secrecy had been heavier than she had acknowledged. She was still the same person with the same complicated past, but at least now she could be honest about who she was and where she had come from. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave, Senior Chief Santos approached. Well done, ma'am. That was exactly what they needed to hear. Think it will help? I know it will. You show them respect by being straight with them, and you showed them confidence by being willing to face their questions. That's going to count for a lot going forward. As Sarah walked back to her office, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she had been completely anonymous, just another administrative officer in a sea of military bureaucracy. Yesterday, her carefully constructed cover had been blown by a moment of anger and pride. Today, she had voluntarily exposed even more of herself in an attempt to manage the fallout. But as she settled back at her desk and looked at the afternoon's coordination tasks, she realized that something had shifted. For the first time since arriving at the command, she felt like she might actually belong here. Not as someone pretending to be something she wasn't, but as someone who could contribute both her administrative skills and her operational experience to help these teams be more effective. It wasn't the quiet transition she had planned, but maybe she thought it was the transition she actually needed. 2 weeks after the briefing, the initial curiosity about Lieutenant Sarah Chen's background had settled into a new normal. The SEALs and support personnel at the command had adapted to the knowledge of her operational experience with the pragmatic flexibility that characterized special operations culture. What emerged was something neither Sarah nor her colleagues had fully anticipated: a work environment where her unique combination of administrative expertise and field experience created opportunities for innovation that benefited everyone. The change became apparent during the weekly logistics coordination meeting, held every Thursday morning in the command's conference room. These meetings typically involved dry discussions of equipment requests, training schedules, and resource allocation. But with Sarah's background now known, the conversations had evolved to include tactical considerations that had previously been overlooked. The ammunition request for next week's training exercise seems high, noted Lieutenant Commander Roberts, the operations officer. Are we sure Team 3 needs that much? Sarah looked up from her notes. Actually, sir, I think they might need more. Roberts raised an eyebrow. More? Based on what? Based on the training scenario they're running, Sarah replied. It's a close-quarters battle exercise in an urban environment with multiple room clearing sequences. In my experience, teams tend to underestimate ammunition consumption in high-stress training scenarios, especially when they're practicing rapid entry techniques. She turned to Master Chief Chun, who was representing Team 3 at the meeting. Master Chief, what's the expected duration of each iteration? About 45 minutes for a complete run-through, he replied. Sarah nodded. And how many iterations are planned? 6 over 2 days. Then you're going to burn through ammunition faster than you think, she said confidently. In similar exercises I've observed, teams typically expend 30 to 40% more rounds than they initially estimate, particularly when they're working on speed and accuracy under time pressure. Roberts looked skeptical. That seems like a significant overestimation. Sir, with respect, I've been in real situations that mirror this training scenario. When you're moving through confined spaces with limited visibility and multiple potential threats, the natural tendency is to engage targets with controlled pairs or even sustained fire to ensure neutralization. The training should reflect that reality. Master Chief Chen leaned forward. Ma'am, are you saying our ammunition calculations are based on unrealistic assumptions? I'm saying they're based on range training assumptions rather than operational training assumptions. There's a difference between shooting at static targets in controlled conditions and engaging targets in dynamic, stressful environments. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For years, ammunition requests had been based on formulaic calculations that didn't account for the psychological and tactical realities of combat situations. Sarah's observation represented a fundamental shift in how they thought about training resource allocation. All right, Roberts said slowly. What do you recommend? Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing. Give me a few minutes to run some calculations based on operational consumption rates I've observed. She worked quietly while the others waited, occasionally asking questions about team size, weapon systems, and specific training objectives. Finally, she turned her laptop screen toward the group. Based on the scenario parameters and team composition, I recommend increasing the ammunition allocation by 35%. That should provide enough rounds for realistic training while maintaining a safety margin for unexpected situations. Master Chief Chun studied the numbers. That's almost exactly what we requested for our last deployment workup, when we had outside consultants helping with the training design. Those consultants probably had similar operational experience to draw from, Sarah noted. The key is matching training consumption to operational reality rather than trying to minimize costs. Lieutenant Commander Roberts made a note in his file. Approved. And, Lieutenant Chun, I'd like you to review our other training resource calculations using this same approach. If we've been consistently underestimating needs, it could be affecting training effectiveness across the board. After the meeting, Senior Chief Santos approached Sarah in the hallway. That was impressive in there. How long have you been thinking about ammunition consumption rates? Since about my third firefight, Sarah replied with a slight smile. You learn pretty quickly that the ammunition you have with you is the ammunition you have, period. If your planning assumptions are wrong, people die. Mind if I ask what you meant about outside consultants? Sarah glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. There are companies that specialize in providing realistic training scenarios for special operations units. Most of their consultants are former operators who bring real-world experience to training design. The fact that Master Chief's team had similar ammunition requirements when working with those consultants validates the approach. And you can apply that kind of analysis to other aspects of our training. Potentially, it's really about understanding the difference between academic planning and operational reality. Academic planning assumes perfect conditions, optimal performance, and minimal variables. Operational planning assumes Murphy's Law, human limitations, and maximum chaos. Santos nodded thoughtfully. I'm starting to understand why Command was so interested in keeping you here. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Petty Officer Tommy Valdez, who had been waiting nearby for an opportunity to speak with Sarah. The relationship between them had evolved considerably since their cafeteria confrontation, transforming from antagonism to something approaching mutual respect. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to ask you about something. Of course, Tommy. What's on your mind? It's about the team-building exercise we're doing next month. The Leadership Challenge course. I'm supposed to help design some of the scenarios, and I was wondering if you might have some insights. Sarah was surprised by the request. Team-building exercises were typically designed by senior enlisted personnel and officers with extensive leadership experience, not by administrative staff. What kind of insights are you looking for? Well, the scenarios are supposed to test decision-making under pressure, team communication, and problem-solving. But most of the ones we use every year are pretty predictable. The guys have seen them before, so they know the solutions. Tommy paused. I was thinking someone with your background might have ideas for scenarios that would really challenge them. Sarah considered the request. Designing training scenarios was outside her normal administrative duties, but it was exactly the kind of contribution she had hoped to make when she accepted the assignment. I'd be willing to help, but I want to make sure we're designing challenges that are educational rather than just difficult. What's the difference? Educational challenges teach specific skills or highlight specific weaknesses that can be addressed through training. Difficult challenges just make people frustrated without providing clear learning objectives. Santos interjected, "That's exactly what we need. Most of our scenarios are either too easy or too hard, without much middle ground." "All right," Sarah said. "Let me think about it and get back to you with some ideas. But I'll need more information about the specific learning objectives and the skill levels of the participants." "I can get you all of that," Tommy replied eagerly. "And ma'am? Thanks. I know this isn't really your job, but I think the team could really benefit from your perspective." As Valdez walked away, Santos turned to Sarah with an expression of amused approval. "You know what just happened there? Tommy asked for help with a training exercise. Tommy Valdez, who 3 weeks ago was questioning your qualifications to coordinate paperwork, just asked you to help design leadership challenges for Navy SEALs." Santos shook her head. "That's not just acceptance, Lieutenant. That's recognition." The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Sarah. In the special operations community, asking someone for professional input was a form of respect that couldn't be faked or mandated. It had to be earned through demonstrated competence and proven judgment. Later that afternoon, Sarah was working on ammunition consumption calculations when her computer chimed with an incoming message. The sender was someone she hadn't heard from in over a year, Major David Kim, a former colleague from her CIA days who now worked at the Pentagon. "Sarah, heard through the grapevine that you've surfaced at NSW Command San Diego. How's civilian life treating you?" David, she stared at the message for several minutes before responding. David knew her well enough to understand the significance of her transition to administrative work, and his casual tone suggested he wasn't aware of the complications that had arisen from her cover being blown. "David, good to hear from you. Civilian life is more complex than expected, but educational. How are things in the building?" "Sarah," his response came back within minutes. "Busy as always. Listen, I'm going to be in San Diego next week for some meetings at SOCM. Any chance we could grab coffee? Would love to hear about your new perspective on things." Sarah hesitated. Meeting with David would mean confronting her old life in a way she hadn't done since leaving the agency. But it might also provide an opportunity to gain some perspective on her current situation from someone who understood both sides of her experience. "Sure. My schedule is flexible. Let me know what works for you." "Great. How about Thursday afternoon? There's a place called Liberty Coffee near the base. 1,500 hours. I'll be there." After confirming the meeting, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, she had been completely isolated from her former colleagues and former identity. Now she was openly discussing operational experience with SEALs, contributing to training design, and preparing to meet with someone from her CIA days. The transformation felt both liberating and unsettling. She had sought administrative work as a way to escape the complexity and moral ambiguity of intelligence operations. But instead of finding simplicity, she had discovered a different kind of complexity that required her to integrate her past experience with her current role in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her contemplation was interrupted by a knock on her door. Commander Hayes entered, looking pleased about something. "Lieutenant, do you have a few minutes?" "Of course, ma'am." Hayes sat down across from her desk. "I wanted to talk to you about the ammunition analysis you presented this morning." Lieutenant Commander Roberts was very impressed. "I'm glad it was helpful. More than helpful. He's asked me to consider expanding your role to include operational planning support for major training exercises." Hayes paused. The position would still be primarily administrative, but it would involve more direct interaction with the teams and more input into how we design and execute training programs. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. What would that look like specifically? You'd continue handling logistics coordination, but you'd also be part of the planning team for quarterly training cycles, special exercises, and pre-deployment workups. Your operational background would be a significant asset in ensuring that our training scenarios accurately reflect real-world conditions. And the teams are comfortable with that level of involvement. Hayes smiled. Lieutenant, Senior Chief Santos, and Master Chief Chun both specifically recommended you for this expanded role. That doesn't happen unless the teams have complete confidence in your abilities. The offer represented exactly the kind of meaningful contribution Sarah had hoped to make when she first requested the administrative assignment. It would allow her to use her experience constructively while maintaining the emotional distance from direct operations that she needed for her psychological well-being. "I'm interested," she said carefully, "but I want to make sure that I'm contributing value rather than just adding another layer of oversight to processes that already work." "That's exactly the right attitude," Hayes replied, "and it's why I think you're the right person for this role. You understand that the goal is to improve effectiveness, not to impose change for its own sake." "When would this transition take effect?" "Immediately, if you accept. We have a major exercise coming up in 6 weeks that would benefit from your input during the planning phase." Sarah considered the offer. 6 weeks ago, she had been a covert operative conducting classified missions in hostile territory. 4 weeks ago, she had been struggling to adapt to life as an anonymous administrative officer. 2 weeks ago, her cover had been blown, and she had thought her transition to civilian-style military service was over. Now she was being offered a role that would allow her to contribute meaningfully to special operations training while maintaining the emotional boundaries she needed. It wasn't the quiet, simple life she had originally envisioned, but it might be something better, a way to serve that honored both her past experience and her current needs. "I accept," she said. Hayes stood and extended her hand. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. I think this is going to work out very well for everyone involved." As her commander left, Sarah looked around her small office and considered how different things were from what she had expected when she first sat down at this desk 5 weeks ago. She had sought anonymity and found recognition. She had sought simplicity and found complexity. She had sought to escape her past and instead had found a way to integrate it constructively with her future. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Lieutenant Chun, this is Master Chief Santos. I just heard about your new role. Welcome to the planning team." "Thank you, Senior Chief. I'm looking forward to working with you." "Same here, ma'am." "And Lieutenant, I think you're going to find that helping train the next generation of operators is a pretty good way to serve your country." After hanging up, Sarah realized that Santos was probably right. She had spent years taking lives in service of her country's interests. Now she had the opportunity to help prepare others to protect lives in service of the same interests. It was a different kind of mission, but it was still a mission worth pursuing. And for the first time since leaving the field, she felt like she might actually be good at it. 3 months had passed since the cafeteria incident that changed everything for Lieutenant Sarah Chun, and the Naval Special Warfare Command had settled into a new rhythm that incorporated her unique blend of administrative expertise and operational experience. What had begun as a crisis of identity had evolved into something none of them had expected, a model for how experienced operators could transition into support roles without losing their value to the mission. Sarah's expanded role as operational planning support had proven even more successful than Commander Hayes had anticipated. Her contributions to training design had resulted in more realistic scenarios, better resource allocation, and improved preparedness for deployed teams. But, perhaps more importantly, her journey from anonymous administrator to recognized expert had inspired other personnel at the command to reconsider their own assumptions about career transitions and professional identity. The quarterly training exercise, known as Operation Neptune Shield, was scheduled to begin the following Monday, and it represented the culmination of Sarah's integration into the planning team. The exercise involved 4 SEAL teams conducting coordinated operations over a 5-day period, with scenarios designed to test everything from small unit tactics to inter-team communication to logistics coordination under pressure. Sarah had been instrumental in designing several of the exercise scenarios, drawing on her operational experience to create challenges that were both realistic and educational. The ammunition consumption calculations that had first demonstrated her value had evolved into comprehensive resource planning that accounted for operational stress, environmental factors, and the psychological realities of sustained training under pressure. On the Thursday afternoon before the exercise was set to begin, Sarah kept her appointment to meet with Major David Kim at Liberty Coffee. She arrived a few minutes early and found a table in the back corner of the shop, a habit from her operational days that she hadn't completely abandoned. When David arrived, she was struck by how familiar and yet foreign he seemed after months of military routine. "Sarah," he said, approaching with a smile and a brief embrace. "You look good. Different but good." "Different how?" "Relaxed, maybe? Less like you're constantly scanning for threats." He sat down across from her and studied her face. "So how's the transition going?" "Really?" Sarah considered the question as she sipped her coffee. "More complicated than I expected, but in better ways than I feared." "That's cryptic, even for you." "My cover got blown about 3 months ago," she said simply. "Turned out it was the best thing that could have happened." David raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Sarah spent the next 30 minutes explaining the cafeteria confrontation, the aftermath, and her evolution from anonymous administrator to operational planning support. David listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "So let me understand this," he said finally. "You went from trying to hide your background to using it actively in your daily work, and that made you more effective rather than less?" "Exactly. It turns out that pretending to be someone I wasn't required more energy than I realized. Once I could be honest about my experience, I could focus that energy on actually contributing to the mission." David leaned back in his chair. That's not what most people experience when they transition out of operations." "How do you mean?" "Most operators who move to administrative roles either struggle with feeling irrelevant, or they become bitter about not being appreciated for what they've done. You seem to have found a way to make your experience relevant without dwelling on it." Sarah nodded slowly. "I think the key was finding a role where my background was useful, but not the primary qualification. I'm not trying to be a SEAL or an operator. I'm trying to be a good administrative officer who happens to understand operations. That's a different thing. And the SEALs you're working with are comfortable with that distinction?" "More than comfortable. They've been incredible to work with once we got past the initial misunderstanding about who I was and what I could contribute." David smiled. "You mean once you proved you weren't going to try to tell them how to do their jobs based on your secret agent credentials?" "Something like that," Sarah laughed. "It turns out that humility goes a long way in special operations communities. They don't care how badass you used to be. They care whether you can help them be more effective now." "That's a lesson that could benefit a lot of people in our business," David observed. "So what's next for you? Is this a permanent transition, or are you planning to come back to the operational side eventually?" The question had been weighing on Sarah's mind more frequently as her comfort in her new role had grown. "Honestly, I don't know. 6 months ago, I would have said this was definitely temporary. A way station while I figured out what I really wanted to do. But now you're finding meaning in it." "Yeah, and that's something I didn't expect. I thought administrative work would feel like a step down, like I was wasting my skills. Instead, it feels like I'm using my skills differently, maybe even more constructively." David studied her face. "You're not missing the adrenaline? The sense of direct impact?" "I'm getting both of those things, just in different ways. When I help design a training scenario that better prepares these guys for what they'll face downrange, that's direct impact. When I see a team perform better because they've trained with more realistic resource constraints, that's an adrenaline rush. Different kind of satisfaction than direct action. Different, but not less meaningful. Maybe more meaningful in some ways, because the impact is broader. Instead of affecting one operation, I'm affecting the preparation for dozens of operations." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "Problem?" David asked. "Not exactly. It's from Tommy Valdez, one of the SEALs I work with. He's asking if I can review the final gear list from Monday's exercise." She showed David the message, which read, "Ma'am, just want to double-check that we've got everything right for Neptune's shield. Your input has been invaluable." "Valdez," David mused. "Isn't that the guy who challenged you in the cafeteria?" "The very same. We've actually become friends, in a way. He learned something about making assumptions, and I learned something about standing up for myself. And now he's asking for your professional opinion. Now he's treating me like a trusted colleague whose expertise he values," Sarah corrected. "It's a different dynamic than I ever had when I was operational. Back then, relationships were always complicated by security concerns, competing priorities, and the stress of life or death situations. This is more collaborative." David nodded thoughtfully. What you're describing sounds like something the agency could learn from. We're not very good at helping people transition between different types of roles. It's usually all or nothing. Maybe that's because we don't think creatively enough about how operational experience can be applied in non-operational contexts. Everyone assumes that once you step back from direct action, your experience becomes irrelevant. But that's not true if you find the right role. Speaking of which, David said, I actually have an ulterior motive for this meeting. There's a position opening up at headquarters that might interest you. Deputy Director for Training and Professional Development. It would involve designing curricula for new operatives and creating transition programs for people moving between different types of assignments. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of interest, followed immediately by uncertainty. That sounds like it would be back in Washington. It would. And it would be a significant step up in terms of responsibility and influence. You'd be shaping how the agency develops and manages talent across all divisions. But it would also mean leaving what I've built here. David leaned forward. Sarah, what you've accomplished at NSW Command is impressive. But imagine scaling that impact across the entire intelligence community. You could help other operators make successful transitions instead of struggling through them alone. The offer was tempting, and Sarah could see the logic in David's argument. She had learned valuable lessons about transition and integration that could benefit others in similar situations. But she had also found something at NSW Command that she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging and purpose that felt sustainable rather than demanding. Can I think about it? Of course. The position wouldn't be available for another 6 months anyway. But I want to put it on your radar because I think you'd be perfect for it. After David left, Sarah sat in the coffee shop for another hour, thinking about the choice he had presented. The CIA position represented a return to her former world, but with the opportunity to apply what she had learned about successful transition. Her current role offered continued growth and satisfaction, but potentially limited impact beyond the teams she directly supported. When she finally returned to base, she found the command buzzing with activity as personnel made final preparations for Operation Neptune Shield. She made her way to the planning center, where Master Chief Santos and several team leaders were conducting a final review of logistics coordination. Ma'am, Santos called out when she entered. Perfect timing. We're just going through the communications plan and wanted to confirm that the backup procedures align with your resource allocation. Sarah spent the next 2 hours working through details with the planning team, reviewing contingencies and ensuring that all aspects of the exercise were properly coordinated. As she worked, she found herself thinking about David's offer and what it would mean to leave this environment. Everything looked good to you, Lieutenant, asked Tommy Valdez, who had been working on equipment staging. Everything looks excellent, Tommy. You guys have done outstanding work on this. We had a good teacher, he replied with a grin. This is going to be the most realistic training exercise we've run in years. As the planning session concluded and personnel began heading home for the evening, Senior Chief Santos approached Sarah's workstation. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? Sure, Senior Chief. Are you planning to stay in this role long term? Because what you've built here with these teams, it would be a real loss if you.